family's ancient oak in coastal Maine, Arthur Corrigan, a third-generation farmer, and his loyal shepherd, Radar, uncover a Cold War cellar that exposes a 60-year conspiracy linking Arthur's grandfather to a murdered partner and a stolen fortune. Maine's standards, the kind of late-season nor'easter that comes shrieking up the coast and leaves barns roofless, fences flattened, and a sea stink hanging in the fields for days afterward. Life. He had been raised with the sound of wind battering clapboard walls and rain pelting the tin roof of the old milking shed. But this one carried a particular cruelty. It toppled what he thought would never fall, the oak that had stood at the center of the family farm for as long as anyone in the county remembered. Its crown had shaded weddings, christenings, and funerals. Its branches had sheltered farmhands at lunch and children at play. His grandfather claimed the tree was older than the house itself, planted back when their family had first staked claim to this rugged patch of Maine soil. Arthur had always believed it would outlast them all. Yet when dawn came, he found the oak laid across the garden like the body of a giant, its roots yanked from the ground, soil and stone clinging like broken teeth to its upended crown. The hole it left was ugly, raw, a wound in the land. Arthur stood there in his mud-caked boots, the smell of brine and wet earth thick in his nose, and felt something inside him twist with grief. He was in his early 40s, his face weathered by sun and wind more than years, his hands broad and calloused from a lifetime of working soil that never gave up its harvest easily. Knew he lived closer to ruin than fortune most seasons, but it had given him a rhythm, a meaning, a tether to land that was both cruel and generous. He had returned to this homestead after his father's stroke left the farm without its keeper. At first he thought he would only stay through the recovery, but his father never truly healed, and the farm became his inheritance, not through papers and deeds, but through necessity. The house, the barn, the fields, and that oak, they were his charge now, as much as the animals he raised and the earth he tilled. Lean Years was Radar, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick coat of sable grey, white patches on his chest and paws, and eyes that carried the same weary loyalty Arthur felt in his own bones. Radar had been skittish when Arthur first brought him home from the shelter, a creature that had known abandonment and distrust. But the two had formed a bond wordlessly, through patience and presence, until Radar seemed to move with him like a shadow, knowing his moods, standing guard when he faltered, offering a quiet companionship that the empty farmhouse otherwise lacked. Trial for them both. Arthur had spent it in the living room, lantern flickering, listening to the house groan and the barns howl, his ears tuned to the pitch of every gust in case it carried the sound of a roof giving way. Radar had pressed against his leg through the worst of it, shivering only when thunder cracked too near, anchoring Arthur with his warmth. By morning, the winds had died and the rain had moved on, leaving silence and ruin in its place. Oak's massive trunk, the bark damp and rough beneath his fingers. "She was older than me, older than Pa, older than any of us," he muttered. "Now she's just timber." Radar nosed the churned earth where the roots had been, whining. At first, Arthur thought the dog was chasing the scent of a burrowed animal disturbed by the fall, but then Radar's body stiffened, his ears pricking, and he began pawing furiously at one corner of the pit. "Leave it, boy," Arthur called, weary. But Radar didn't stop. His claws scraped at damp soil, scattering clumps aside until something hard clinked against his nails. Arthur frowned, knelt, and brushed away the dirt with his calloused hand. What he uncovered made his breath hitch. Not stone, but a plate of rusted iron, flat and rectangular, set flush with the earth. A hatch, crouched there, rain dripping from the tips of his hair, staring at the impossible sight. The oak had grown above this place for generations. Whatever this was, it had been hidden deliberately, buried deep enough to be forgotten. His grandfather's farm was full of relics, a trapdoor in the hayloft no one used, an old iron pump rusting behind the barn. But nothing like this. He pushed aside more dirt until a wheel-like handle emerged, crusted with rust. His heart thumped hard. The hatch was heavy, sealed, and stubborn. He fetched a crowbar, a can of oil, and his old sledgehammer from the workshop, the tools of a farmer, but also of a man who knew how to break what was meant to last. For an hour he worked, pounding, prying, oiling and straining until at last the wheel shrieked loose and the hatch groaned open. A breath of cold, stale air wafted upward, carrying the smell of mildew, damp stone, and something sharper, like dust sealed too long. Radar growled low in his throat, uneasy, but Arthur's curiosity pushed him forward. Concrete steps into darkness. Flashlight beam cutting a cone through the gloom. What he found at the bottom made him stumble to a halt. It was a fallout shelter, the kind built during the Cold War, with bare concrete walls, a desk, empty shelves, and an old shortwave radio set gathering dust. But there was something else, an olive-drab military ammo box shoved beneath the desk, heavy with age. Arthur dragged it out, cracked the seal, and inside found a leather-bound journal. The handwriting on its first page was instantly familiar. He had seen it on receipts, on the back of calendars, on yellowing notes taped to the barn door when he was a boy, his grandfather's, John Corian. At first, the entries were mundane, the price of seed, weather notes, timber shipments. But as Arthur read further, the tone changed. References to the partners, to the project, to secrecy and fear. Names reduced to initials, VC. And then a passage that chilled him more than the concrete air. A secret is a debt. I fear this one will one day come due for our families. Arthur sat back hard in the chair, the leather journal heavy in his hands. He had always thought of his grandfather as a quiet farmer, a man of soil and stubborn pride. But these pages hinted at something darker, something hidden beneath their very land. He closed the book, the weight of it pressing against his chest, and climbed back into daylight. Radar waited at the edge of the pit, tail thumping once, eyes fixed on his master as if asking what ghost he had brought up with him. To his chores, mending fence, checking feed, clearing storm damage, but the bunker gnawed at him. Every time he stretched wire or stacked timber, the memory of that hidden chamber returned, its stale air clinging to his thoughts like damp cloth. At night, he sat at the kitchen table, lamp burning low, the ammo box before him. Inside lay the journal, its leather cover cracked, its pages worn and yellowed by time. He read and reread it, lips moving silently as he traced his grandfather's handwriting. Some entries were straightforward, notes about planting cycles, tool repairs, prices of seed. Others were veiled, full of symbols and half-phrases, cryptic references that left Arthur restless. The ledger buried where the oak roots drink, one line read. Another mentioned the partner's silence, and yet another ended abruptly, ink smeared as if the pen had been snatched from his grandfather's hand. Sensed that he was circling something vast, a shadow his grandfather had left behind on purpose, both warning and confession. But the meaning eluded him. He rose with the dawn, shoulders heavy, dragging himself into chores that felt like rituals meant only to distract. He mucked out stalls, repaired a tractor belt, stacked split wood by the porch, but always at the edge of his vision, he saw the oak stump and the patch of earth where the storm had torn open the past. And then, on the fourth morning, the rhythm of the farm was broken. A sedan appeared at the far end of the gravel lane, its glossy paint catching the pale sun, its hum too refined for this rough stretch of land. Arthur paused by the barn, shading his eyes, uneasy. The vehicle crunched its slow way forward, out of place among the battered pickups and tractors that usually rolled this road. Radar, ears pricked, trotted to Arthur's side, his growl low but uncertain, more alert curiosity than threat. The car came to a stop near the porch. A door opened, and a woman stepped out, about 30, dressed plainly, but with the careful neatness of someone accustomed to archives and offices rather than barns. Dark hair was tied back at the nape of her neck, and glasses caught the morning light, flashing like signal mirrors. A satchel was slung across her shoulder, bulging with papers. She stood for a moment, taking in the farmhouse, the scar of earth where the oak had once towered, and then she walked toward Arthur with a measured pace, neither timid nor overbold. When she reached him, she offered her hand. "My name is Isa Vance," she said. Her voice carried both formality and an undertone of urgency. "I think we may share a history neither of us expected." Arthur hesitated before taking her hand, noting the firmness of her grip, the steadiness of her gaze. She explained that she was a historical researcher, piecing together threads from her family's past. Her grandfather, Elias Vance, had been an engineer, a name Arthur vaguely recalled hearing in town once, long ago, attached to a man of quiet repute. Among Elias's papers, Isa said, she had discovered references to a partnership with John Corian and William Croft. The words hung between them like a tolling bell. Arthur's chest tightened. The names, placed together, rang too close to what the journal hinted. Isa slid the satchel from her shoulder and drew out a folder. From it, she produced a photograph, edges curled, black and white fading, but still clear. She held it out with both hands. Arthur took it, and the sight rooted him to the ground. 3 young men stood proudly in front of this very house, the porch railings new, the oak towering behind them. His grandfather, John Corian, was in the middle, his face younger but unmistakable, wearing a smile Arthur had seen in family albums. To his right stood Elias Vance, sharp-eyed, formal, his stance betraying a touch of humility. And to the left, one hand cocked arrogantly on his hip, was William Croft. Croft on the other. Arthur's gut tightened. V.C. Isa explained that their grandfathers had signed a private agreement in 1961, one that was about to expire. It referenced a shared asset hidden on this land. Arthur reluctantly revealed the journal, and together they pored over it. Numbers in the margins, coordinates that made no sense until Arthur, with a farmer's eye for grids and fields, realized they could mark measurements within the bunker. Triangulation, a hidden spot in the concrete wall. Before they could act, another vehicle arrived. A black SUV, out of place and menacing, its polished frame catching the last smear of daylight like a predator's eye. Gravel crunched under thick tires as it rolled to a stop, and 3 men stepped out with the practiced ease of those who had done this many times before. They moved in a tight wedge, scanning the yard with sharp, measuring glances. Every gesture rehearsed intimidation. At their center walked Julian Croft, heir to William Croft, carrying himself with the assurance of a man convinced the world still bent to his name. Smooth, cold, and predatory, his very presence seemed to drain the air of warmth. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. His eyes, pale and calculating, swept over Arthur, Isa, and the dog at their side before fixing on the house, on the oak stump, on the place where the storm had torn the earth apart. "You know why I'm here," he said, his voice as flat as glass. "Hand it over. The asset belongs to me." His words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They carried the weight of generations of greed, sharpened into command. Arthur stood firm, his boots rooted in the soil that had raised him. Though fear tugged at the edges of his resolve, he felt Radar's presence at his side. Steady, bristling, a wall of loyalty that no threat could shake. The shepherd's growl rumbled low in his throat, ears pinned forward, every muscle taut, as if he understood exactly who stood before them and what he represented. Isa's hands trembled, but she refused to step back. Together, they faced Julian, and though Arthur's heart pounded, his voice came out steady. "This land's seen enough theft. You won't find what you're looking for here." For a moment, Julian's mouth curved into something between a smile and a sneer. He studied Arthur, as though gauging the strength of a board before putting his weight on it. Then, with a casual shrug that made the hairs on Arthur's neck rise, he turned away. "This changes nothing," he said, his tone smooth and chilling, like a knife pressed to the skin without breaking it. He looked over his shoulder, eyes gleaming. "I'll be back." With that, he slid into the SUV, his men folding in behind him, and the black vehicle rolled away into the night, its taillights glowing like embers fading into the dark. That night, silence weighed heavy on the farmhouse. Every creak of the rafters seemed to echo Julian's promise. Neither Arthur nor Isa could sleep, the air thick with dread. Finally, Arthur rose, pulled on his boots, and lit the lantern. "We can't leave it," he said simply. Isa, pale but resolute, nodded. Radar was already waiting at the door, tail stiff, nose twitching as though urging them onward. They carried a sledgehammer down into the bunker, its handle worn smooth by years of labor. The air was damp, the walls pressing close, shadows trembling under the lantern's glow. Guided by Radar's insistent nose, they found the section of wall that smelled different, old stone concealing something long hidden. Arthur raised the hammer, the weight of it humming through his arms, and struck. The blow rang out like thunder, dust raining down. He struck again, and again, each impact shaking loose fragments of earth until the wall groaned and split. At last, the barrier gave way, and with a shudder, the wall broke open, revealing a sealed compartment. Inside, shrouded in dust and silence, lay a heavy leather briefcase. Its surface was cracked with age, the handle stiff, the lock tarnished. Arthur lifted it carefully, the weight of it more than physical, as though he carried not just leather and paper, but decades of buried sin. Together, with Isa holding the lantern high and Radar pacing at their heels, they carried it up the narrow stairs and into the kitchen. There, at the worn table that had once held meals and laughter, they set the briefcase down. Isa's fingers trembled as she worked at the lock until it gave way with a reluctant snap. They opened it with hands that shook, the air thick with anticipation. Inside lay neat stacks of documents. Stock certificates brittle with age, land deeds stamped and sealed, bank records that traced the flow of wealth like veins through a body. Arthur read the names printed on them and froze. They weren't Croft's. They weren't Vance's. They weren't even his grandfather's. Every page bore the same name, Mateo Reyes. Arthur's throat tightened. Who was he? He whispered, though some part of him already knew the answer lay in blood and betrayal. Isa's eyes brimmed as she rifled through the papers, her breath catching when she reached the bottom of the case. Beneath the documents lay a reel-to-reel tape, its label yellowed but still legible. October 1963. Radio, hands moving with the care of a man opening a grave. The machine whirred, the reels turning, and through the crackle of static a voice emerged, brittle but unmistakable. Elias Vance, Isa's grandfather, speaking in the low, uneven tones of confession. His words spilled into the kitchen, filling every corner, impossible to silence. There were 4 of us, the voice said. Corrian, Vance, Croft, and Reyes. Mateo Reyes, he was the mind, the builder, the one who made the fortune real. He trusted us. He believed in us. But William Croft, his hunger grew. He wanted more, always more. We lured Mateo into the woods. I can still hear the leaves underfoot, the way the night closed in. Croft raised the gun. John Corrian stood there, frozen. God forgive me, I did nothing. The shot rang out. Mateo fell. We buried him where no one would ever find him. Then we took what was his. We took his life's work and wore it like it was ours. The voice faltered, then pressed on, broken with regret. The money, the land, the houses, all of it. It was never ours. It was stolen. It was stained from the start. Arthur sat motionless, the words digging into him like thorns. Isa covered her face, tears seeping through her fingers. Radar whined softly, as though even he understood the depth of the wound opening before them. The tape crackled on, Elias's voice sinking into silence, leaving behind only the hum of the machine and the heavy truth that settled in the room like ash. The money that built the farm, the house, everything. It was blood-tainted. Arthur reeled. His grandfather, the man who had taught him to plant rows straight and mend harness leather, had been complicit in murder. The revelation split him open like a storm-shattered tree. Memories of quiet evenings in the barn, his grandfather's voice steady and sure, suddenly twisted into a darker shape. What had once been lessons in craft now felt like rehearsals for deception. His stomach clenched, and the walls of the cellar seemed to close in around him, the air thick with mildew and betrayal. Isa wept, her shoulders shaking, her image of her grandfather shattered beyond repair. She had grown up thinking herself heir to a legacy of resilience and dignity, only to find herself bound to bloodshed and theft. The briefcase on the table was no treasure. It was a curse, its very weight pressing down on both of them like a judgment from the grave. Then came a knock at the door. The sound was soft but unyielding, 3 measured raps that carried through the farmhouse like the toll of a bell. Arthur opened it, and there stood an elderly woman, silver hair pulled into a bun, her eyes dark with grief, but lit with a glimmer of hard-earned wisdom. Time had carved her face, but her presence carried a strength that filled the threshold. She introduced herself, her voice calm and deliberate, as Sophia Reyes, Mateo's granddaughter. She explained that she had lived down the road her entire life, enduring the quiet cruelty of neighbors' whispers, carrying the stain of a family branded as thieves. She had spent her life tending her garden, raising her children, keeping her dignity intact, even as suspicion clung to her like a shadow. And though she had long suspected the truth of what had been done to her grandfather, she had never held proof. Until now, standing in Arthur's kitchen with the briefcase between them. Her eyes glistened as she touched the cracked leather of the case. "I always knew my grandfather's hands were clean," she whispered, voice breaking, "but no one believed me. They laughed. They said we were liars who cried wolf. And yet, here it is. The truth buried under your oak. For a moment, silence held them, broken only by the low whine of Radar, who seemed to sense the weight of grief stretching across generations. Arthur swore then, his words sharp and steady, that he would not let Croft reclaim what his family had stolen. The sins of his grandfather would not be repeated. He clenched his fist on the kitchen table, his jaw set with a resolve that felt older than himself. He promised Sophia that what had been hidden in darkness would not return to darkness, and that he would stand in the light even if it meant tearing down the very soil he'd been raised on. He called his old friend Ben Carter, now the county sheriff, a man whose word was as solid as the stone bridge over the river. The conversation was brief but urgent, the two men speaking in clipped tones honed from years of trust. Arthur explained the discovery, the threat of Croft, the proof that had surfaced. Carter's voice on the other end was grim, carrying the weight of law and loyalty both. "Hold fast," he told Arthur. "We'll be there. Don't let him walk out with that case." Plans took shape quickly, measured in minutes instead of hours. Deputies were dispatched. Roads were quietly closed, the old farmhouse surrounded in silence that only the hawks overhead knew. 2 hours later, when Croft returned, he came with more men. Their trucks ground up the gravel lane, engines rumbling like an advancing storm. Arthur stood waiting, sweat running down his back beneath his shirt, his heart hammering but his face calm. Isa stood behind him, her hand trembling on the kitchen doorframe, while Sophia sat straight-backed in a chair, refusing to move, refusing to cower. Radar prowled at Arthur's side, muscles taut, eyes locked on the figures spilling from the trucks. Croft strode ahead, his smile sharp, his confidence unchecked, as though the land and its secrets already belonged to him. Arthur forced himself to meet Croft's eyes with a blankness that belied the storm raging inside. He led them down the steps into the bunker, his boots echoing against the earth-packed floor, the air heavy with damp stone, and the memory of crimes long hidden. He pretended to yield, to falter. His shoulders slumped as though the fight had drained from him. Croft leaned forward, greedy eyes narrowing, his hand brushing the briefcase with hunger. And in that instant, Arthur struck. He lifted his shotgun and fired a birdshot round into the earthen wall, the blast deafening in the confined space. Soil and dust exploded into the air, filling the bunker with choking clouds that turned men into shadows. The sudden chaos tore through Croft's confidence. Radar lunged, a streak of muscle and fury, teeth flashing as he brought one of the guards down in a tangle of limbs and shouts. The man hit the ground hard, groaning as the shepherd held him pinned. Above the din, Arthur's voice rang out, low and commanding, "It ends here." And in that moment, the rising wail of sirens cut through the dust and confusion, growing louder, closer, until their piercing cry filled the night. Red and blue lights splashed against the farmhouse walls, and heavy boots thundered on the steps. The trap had sprung. Carter's timing was flawless. Croft spun in shock as shadows moved at the door, and sirens wailed outside as Carter and his deputies closed in. Croft was arrested, spitting fury, his family's decades of scheming undone by a farmer, a historian, an old woman, and a loyal dog. Officers had to drag him to the cruiser, his face red with rage, his words tumbling into incoherent curses that carried across the farmyard. Neighbors who had gathered at the sight of flashing lights whispered to one another, some shaking their heads, others staring as though a century of shadow had finally broken open. What none of them missed was the small figure of Radar, ears erect, watching the man with the calm, unblinking eyes of a creature that knew when something dangerous had been caged at last. Weeks of legal proceedings followed, a blur of courtrooms and depositions, the air heavy with the smell of paper and ink, with the weight of voices recounting events long thought buried. The briefcase and tape became evidence, artifacts pulled from the earth like relics from another age. Prosecutors laid them on long tables as if placing bones before the public, piecing together a crime that had lived too long in whispers. Reporters filled every bench, their notebooks scratching down details that soon spilled across headlines. Storm unearths Cold War scandal. Farmer and dog expose family's secret. Each new edition carried the tale of greed, betrayal, and a 60-year-old crime unearthed by storm and chance. sorrow as he read the words. He hadn't wanted to be known. He hadn't wanted the glare of curiosity, the probing questions of men who saw only scandal where Arthur had felt only grief. But Isa reminded him gently that truth, once revealed, had a way of healing wounds no silence ever could. At last, Arthur and Isa renounced all claim to the assets, standing side by side in a courtroom that smelled faintly of varnish and dust. They spoke with steady voices, their decision echoing through the chamber. The funds, the properties, the accounts, all of it would pass to Sophia Reyes, the rightful heir, whose family had been wronged generations ago. The woman's hands trembled as the judge confirmed the transfer, and when she turned to Arthur, tears streaked her weathered face. "You have given us back our name," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of gratitude. Arthur bowed his head, unable to find words, knowing only that he had restored something no ledger could ever measure. But even with justice done, Arthur could not stay. The farm felt poisoned, its timbers soaked in a history he no longer wished to carry. Every creak of the house seemed to whisper betrayal. Every gust through the rafters carried ghosts. He walked the fields at dusk and felt the soil heavy with secrets. The land no longer a sanctuary, but a reminder of wounds carved deep. He knew that if he remained, the rot of memory would take root in him as surely as it had in those before. So he sold the land to a conservancy, his terms clear and unyielding. The acreage must remain wild, untouched, a living memorial to the storm that had uncovered its buried truths. The oak's scar would be left to heal on its own, the earth settling back into silence without the weight of ploughs or fences. Where once had been scheming and greed, there would now be meadow and forest, a place for birdsong instead of whispers. Arthur packed only what he needed, a few changes of clothes, his tools worn smooth by years of labor, a handful of books whose spines had carried him through lonely winters, and the ammo box that held his grandfather's journal. Its pages more a warning than a comfort. Everything else he left behind. The furniture, the trinkets, even the photographs that seemed too heavy with complicated faces. He did not look back as he closed the farmhouse door for the last time. On his final morning, the light was thin, the air sharp with the smell of dew and earth. Arthur walked to the pit where the oak had once stood, now filled and levelled, but still marked with a faint seam in the soil. He knelt there, pressing his palm against the cool ground, as if to acknowledge the weight of what had been hidden and the cost of its unveiling. Beside him, Radar sat patiently, the shepherd's steady breath rising and falling, a reminder that some bonds could weather any storm. Arthur buried his hands in Radar's thick fur, leaning close until his forehead brushed the dog's neck. His voice cracked, low but certain, carrying not only loss, but also the faintest flicker of hope. "It's just you and me now, boy." They drove west into the sunrise, the farm shrinking in the rearview mirror. Arthur had lost land, wealth, and the illusions of family honor. But he had kept his soul. Radar sat upright in the passenger seat, eyes bright, ears perked, as if already watching the road to whatever new life lay ahead. Color, soft gold bleeding into pink, the kind of morning that made even a weary man feel as if the world might forgive him. Arthur gripped the wheel with calloused hands, still smelling faintly of soil and timber, remnants of the life he was leaving behind. His chest ached, not from defeat, but from the slow release of something heavy that had weighed there for years. Expectations, secrets, and the kind of lies that rot a family from the inside out. Radar leaned his head toward the window, nose twitching at the scents carried on the dawn wind. Salt, pine, and the faint trace of smoke from chimneys in towns they hadn't yet reached. Every so often he gave a small huff, a sound that landed in Arthur's ears like reassurance. The dog didn't care about deeds or bank ledgers or court documents. He cared that Arthur was still here, still steady behind the wheel, still his man. Arthur thought about the cellar door yawning open under the fallen oak, about the rusted lock and the papers brittle with time. He thought of his grandfather's name scrawled on the pages, the accusations, the debts, the fortune gone missing, and the man who had vanished into history with only whispers left behind. The storm had exposed it all, dragging old ghosts into the light. For days, Arthur had wrestled with the knowledge, the shame pressing against his ribs like a vice. But now, with the farm fading behind them, he felt the vice loosen. The fields they passed looked nothing like his own. These were other men's furrows, other men's barns standing proud against the wind. For the first time in decades, Arthur wasn't measuring himself against them. He wasn't thinking about how many acres his family once held, or how the Corrian name used to mean something at the grain exchange. He was thinking only of the road, long and unspooling, and the freedom of not knowing exactly where it ended. Radar shifted and placed a paw gently on Arthur's arm, a simple reminder that presence mattered more than destination. Arthur smiled faintly and gave the paw a squeeze. In that small exchange lay a kind of truth his family had never understood. Wealth could vanish, land could be lost, but loyalty, the steady, wordless kind, was a fortune all its own. The storm had uprooted more than a tree. It had torn open the ground to reveal a past of greed and betrayal, but in doing so, it had also given Arthur something unexpected, the chance to choose a different legacy. Not one of silence and shame, but of truth, loyalty, and the quiet companionship of a dog who never judged, only stayed. And sometimes, Arthur thought as the truck rolled on, that was more than enough.